Welcome, Pathfinders and all wandering wanderers eager to explore paths to better tech futures together. We are Tethic's Firekeepers, Ale Isakovic and Matthew Mitka, inviting you to reflect on the lunacy of tech and explore the paths not so well traveled. Each podcast episode is a meandering exploration inspired by the seeds planted in our Pathfinders New Moon's letter at the beginning of the lunation cycle and the paths illuminated during our full moon gathering. You can find more about us and our pathfinding adventure at tethix.co/pathfinders. This episode was inspired by our observations that ChatGPT seems to have a stronger moral compass than its makers. When asked about the ethics of questionable business decisions such as using people's voices without their consent, ChatGPT presents diverse considerations from different points of view and advocates for upholding ethical standards. This made us wonder, would executives like Sam Altman make more ethical decisions if they were using their creations in day to day moral deliberations? And even more broadly, could we use large language models such as ChatGPT to help us communicate better, resolve interpersonal conflicts and tensions, and perhaps even make better collective decisions? So, the guiding question for today's exploration is, should we use AI chatbots as mediators in human affairs? Welcome back, Matt.
Good to be back as the moon wanes, Alia. Thank you.
All right, let's get right into it. Perhaps let's start by unpacking our guiding question a bit. Why do we even think that we as humans might need better mediators? What are some of your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and that's a really good starting point. Like, why do we need them in the first place? Like, why are we actually asking this question and considering this question? And there's, I think, several layers to this. There's firstly that communication between people at scale in large groups is hard. Like in our modern societies, effective communication is increasingly difficult. Especially when we're in environments where there's quite divisive topics that are raised, like our information ecology, our media. Exacerbates that and amplifies these things because it actually gets engagement. So there's the complexity of those issues and the diversity of perspectives that often leads to misunderstandings and just breakdowns in dialogue. And social media is really such a melting pot for these things to play out, where people are herded into these echo chambers, and rather than constructive dialogue, it's unconstructive most of the time. So I think that that's kind of like the first one. It's just like the communication between people is hard. And I think secondly, there's a lack of practice in mediation. Like, we don't get the opportunity to practice conflict resolution. We're not taught those skills. We don't develop that active communication skills in our education, although I think it is increasingly becoming part of early school curricula. But there's obviously like this tendency that we want to avoid friction and conflict and tension, and that kind of bias that we have to avoid that, generally kind of leads to that lack of practice in the social cognition that's required to have effective group dynamics. Yes, it's kind of like the avoidance, and then additionally, just the we're economically incentivized to compete. In a workplace, there's an immediate dynamic and opportunity that we're presented with, where it's incentivizing competition versus kind of collaboration, that generally leads to kind of low trust, that makes mediation, and effective techniques in mediation and cooperation much more challenging.
Yeah, this reminds me of our previous episode discussion about time and how we have all this technology. This is supposed to help us save time, but we all end up feeling rushed and we are hurrying about our days at work. We are rushed from meeting to meeting, and we are not really paying attention in our meetings. We are, just thinking about how busy we are. And then in our spare time, yeah, we open social media where we're just the one to get that dopamine boost or whatever. And we're just rushing and reacting to everything we see online, because there's so much content online, so much outrage going on. And yeah, at the same time, we don't have, like you said, these healthy community spaces and infrastructure and opportunities where we could really practice communication. And good communication is hard, right? It takes time, and we are constantly rushed, like you mentioned, the incentives to compete rather than collaborate. So I think, the time component that we discussed in the previous episode also comes in a bit. And but at the
Mm,
same time, it seems like we're in at this like crossroads in just like society, where we should be spending more time talking about what we want, what kind of future we want. And to kind of connect it back to our also theme of AI, we should be right now having discussions like we're having right now on how we want to use this technology. Do we want to use this technology at all? And we're not having these discussions. So I guess
mm,
the why we started this question is because we feel like generally in society we should be having more conversations, more nuanced discussions. And so far we have not been doing a good job on it, in especially online community spaces. And that's another conversation we already have had on our podcast. So yeah, we started wondering whether AI chatbots might help us a bit, um, to mediate our conversations, because we certainly seem to be having a lot of problems in how we relate to each other. And we hold very strong opinions and are not really willing to listen. And social media has actually not been really helpful in getting us in helping us listen to what the other side is saying, right? And finding that
mm.
those commonalities. And we're also, I think, on social media and at work as well, encouraged to always be performing, to show up as, best versions of ourselves, to make ourselves look good. So there's
Mm.
this individualism that also come into play, that is not really helping us communicate better and collaborate better.
Yeah, I mean, we start from I think in many situations, we kind of start from a position of distrust, like it's a zero sum game, like the hyper competitive
Mm,
incentivization that we have in so much of our environments, like political environments, like our economic, our employment environments, general social environments. That means that people start from positions of distrust, and that mindset complicates the process of finding consensus and resolving conflicts. And that the individualism and our like separation, this lack of relationality that we do struggle with in modern Western societies to kind of broadly uh, categorize them. That promotion of individualism, it shapes our perceptions of self and other, and that makes it really harder to see and have a broader perspective, seeing things much more holistically. So we're conditioned to view ourselves as these separate kind of entities rather than
mm,
interconnected parts of a greater whole and web of life. And our communities, our neighborhoods, our societies, like we don't see ourselves as the whole. We see ourselves as these parts. And I think that's a contributing factor to like why we might be needing some help from possibly these technologies as well. What about like the I guess the influence of cultural and economic forces like this worshipping of Moloch How does that kind of come into this as well?
Yeah, those are some great questions, and this thing that we're thinking in parts rather than whole, so we're not thinking about like entire communities. And obviously online tools have given us so much good things, but they also in some ways have encouraged harmful ways of tribalism, because we are longer incentivized to get to know our neighbors, people who live in our local communities, but we can find people who just agree with us online, and then we form these echo chambers. And
Mm,
obviously, we convince that that's all there is in the world. And obviously, we're also separated from more than human life, because we are so focused on human affairs and the economics incentives, and we live in times when we are facing, on the one hand, the climate crisis, but on the other hand we're also all living with um, increasingly high costs of living. All our bills are somehow increasing for no good reason every day, and that puts us on the defensive. We're not as curious about each other and the world and the role we could play in it. We're just focused on survival. And in those kind of circumstances, it's very tempting to start worshiping the Moloch and thinking, what can we sacrifice? We can sacrifice time, our relations with our neighbors, to gain a bit more power or influence online. And yeah, it's a very harmful, basically, environment for communication and how we establish our human affairs, and how we see the world.
mm. Yeah, this kind of metaphorical worship of Moloch. These, it really just reflects these kind of destructive tendencies that we have, that are really just it's detrimental to both our human well-being and our ability to flourish as individuals and collectively as a society, but also the broader web of life and the ecological context that we exist within and are independent and interdependent too. And that's a yeah, these different layers are really crucial, and we need to figure out, like, okay, what tools can we use to support us in this process? Like, we've gone through, like, yeah, there's all these problems with the way that we communicate now, and there's all these reasons where it's like it's not ideal. um so how do we look at where these technologies actually might be able to support, and what are the kind of contexts and the scales in which they might actually be able to help us?
Right, because we got curious about this question when we were experimenting with ChatGPT and testing the um, the ethics of decisions that executives such as Sam Altman makes, and how these big tech companies actually act in the marketplace, and they are showing all signs of uh, their dedication and worship to Moloch, and cremation of care and all those things in the way they conduct themselves, because they prioritize short-term business games, and have this winner takes all mentality. And as we listed so many cases now, and keep listing them in the new newsletter, of where basically these companies continue to extract and exploit people, resources, and basically everything that stands in their way. But what is interesting is that, because LLMs like ChatGPT learned from diverse human knowledge, they seem to have a pretty good grasp of what are considered some general ethical standards, and general human consensus on what is the right thing to do. um so that's kind of like an interesting paradox, that the people who have basically are so focused just on short-term business outcomes have created this thing that actually is able to look at different perspectives, different fields of knowledge, and provide a way more nuanced answers that we usually get in business or in social media these days. So that's kind of curious. And something that we've also observed as we use these tools ourselves and as we talk to people using these tools is that there seems to be this curious phenomenon that we perceive machines and by extension LLMs like ChatGPT as impartial. So we are seeing an increasing number of people going to tools like ChatGPT for an impartial opinion. So if you're having an argument, and we used to resolve arguments by googling things, basically, when we're like having arguments about some facts, he would go, "Oh, let's just Google it, see who's right." Um, and we're slowly transitioning to basically using ChatGPT. Oh, let's ask ChatGPT, right? When we're having like a conversation on some topic. So maybe we can explore this perception of impartiality a bit, because we know, LLMs are not like these divine entities that are omniscient and omnipotent. They learned from our data, so from all our human biases and flaws, but at the same time we see them as impartial, right? Which is quite curious.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think it reflects many aspects of how we interact with computers and the biases that we have. There's this kind of assumption of objectivity. Be that because people have a general kind of mental model that this is kind of math. These things work on logic, and there's binary behind it, and therefore like the output like has some objectivity to it. And that's fundamentally inaccurate because there's a huge amount of biases, like be that like in the statistical average output that we get from these massive inference machines that are large language models. So there's that is kind of like the assumption of objectivity, and a cultural conditioning that we've got. Like society has often associated technology, and particularly now with AI and this kind of broad category, probably much more associated with Gen AI and foundational models. That it's kind of rational, and there's precision to it. And even the interface, the design of the tools, like you get this output that is it comes out really quick and it's fast, and it seems like, wow, this makes sense. Like this is like solid rationale in what's actually being presented. It's might be broken down. So I think there's like a perception that we get, and that there's in our culture uh, that we have this conditioning that reinforces the belief that AI could or may serve as like a neutral kind of arbiter in human affairs. So I think there's that, but we obviously know that there's challenges to that impartiality, like the bias in the training data, the algorithmic bias that exists there. So yeah, I mean, where we might go, oh yeah, there's assumption. We see these things as potentially objective, but what are these challenges to that particular point of view?
What's also interesting as I was listening to that, basically we have two main narratives when it comes to AI. It's either people say, oh, it's like a magic technology, or it's people arguing, oh no, it's just statistics. Which is interesting because if you're saying it's just statistics, in some sense, right, you're also making an argument that it's like a rational, precise mathematical thing, in some sense. And like, I know there's nuance to that, but we seem to hold statistics and science in our society to like a higher standard. And it's we often say how science is like unbiased, right? And it's trying to be unbiased. So by extension, if this thing is just statistics, it must be in some ways impartial. But at the same time, if it's magic, then maybe it has some magical omniscient powers, like a divine entity. So yeah, it seems like no matter where you stand on this argument and how you describe these LLMs, right? You bump into this perception of impartiality from different points of views, but it's also, I think, a lot has to say with not just the user interface, but how these tools, these chatbots interact with us and their communication styles, because they come across, especially, ChatGPT comes across as very confident, even if when it's hallucinating, like obviously it has no sense that it's like just spitting out bullshit, but it's answers every question with absolute certainty. And we've kind of become conditioned not to question that, right? We fall for people who talk in that way, and chat gpt comes across in this sense of, trust me, like sense of authority, trust me, I know what I'm talking about. At the same time, it's also approachable because it keeps saying, oh, there's no stupid question, ask me anything, we can talk about anything, which doesn't make people feel dumb. And I think I've heard some people from OpenAI actually saying that they've actually worked really hard at finding that balance where you don't feel ignorant, even though ChatGPT has like answers to any topic you can you can ask it, like you can imagine, right? And there's also this thing where ChatGPT also keeps saying, I don't have preferences. I'm just here to help you. So in a sense, it's not like a human who has an agenda and who is trying to sell you something, convince you something. It's like,
Mm,
so a lot of the things that ChatGPT actually says and how it phrases its question is it's kind of reinforcing that, oh, you can trust me. I'm just here to help. Um, you know, so that's also a big part of why we, I think, often see them as impartial, even though if
mm,
rationally we know there's all these biases and limitations. But I think just the feeling we get is, oh, this entity, whatever it is, whether it's magic or a statistical engine, knows a lot, right?
mm.
And it's not trying to convince me of anything. It's here to help me. So, it's here for me.
Yeah, it's um, trust me, I'm here to help you. Uh, yeah, and the gap between like perception and reality, like we can't discern the veracity of what is presented that quickly unless like we're absolute kind of experts in a field in which we've been querying or engaged in a conversation with these systems. So while we might have the perception of impartiality and objectivity, it doesn't always align to reality because there's all the biases that are embedded in these systems that are really they're not visible to us, which makes it harder for us to like detect. It's not like when you engage in the chat interface, you can switch to like a, I don't know, a graph node view that kind of shows you like how the inferences have been made and what the weightings are and like where there might be actually disproportionate weighting towards a particular point of view because of the training data set that these systems have been trained on. So I think that false sense of security and trust in these decisions becomes really important, like to bring about. But also, the research that we were looking at just on kind of sycophancy and user influence, that these kind of systems are that are trained with human uh, feedback, reinforcement learning, that they exhibit this sycophancy. They're kind of influencing, and responding in ways that actually align to user beliefs because that's actually what the human wants, rather than challenging them or presenting alternative points of view, unbiased perspectives. So that undermines any sense of impartiality because it's kind of reinforcing existing biases as a result as well.
Yeah, although it depends on the use case and how, like, what you use them for. Because
Mm,
if you ask them, right, to present diverse viewpoints, they can actually do that as well. So it's, yeah, hard to really talk in absolutes. But there's definitely, I think, if we also make, and again, the connection of this story of separation that we have in our society, right, and this worship of rationality. I think also the fact that LLMs don't have physical bodies. They are almost in a way unburdened by bodies. And there's all this, especially in Silicon Valley, attempts at transcending the burden of the human body, right, and becoming pure thought and mind. And there's a lot of people that seem to, like, kind of put rationality on a pedestal. So here we have this entity, and we are even, like, struggling to find the right metaphor for it, because it's not like an oracle or a sage, because it's still, like, very approachable. It's not even like a god that is omniscient and omnipotent, because it comes down to your level. So it's almost like Jesus walking among mortals. But it's not the right metaphor either, right?
mm,
So we are kind of, I think, also struggling to kind of make sense of what is this thing that seems to know everything. And at the same time, we are constantly being told of these stories of geniuses, and how we are worshiping people who know a lot of things and are smart. So we encounter this entity that seems to know something about almost anything. And we think, well, they must be smart, right? So they must be like some body, even if they don't have a body, worth listening to. So
mm.
I think it's also confusing to us as humans, as to what these things even are, because, like, what do we compare them to?
Yeah,
we
that's
we
right.
yeah.
Yeah, what are the corollaries like in the world that we kind of try and match our mental model of like these systems, like with that makes it hard, and I think like the point that yeah they can come down to your level, right? If like you want it to break things down in a kind of Eli 5, explain it like I'm a 5-year-old, like it'll do that. And you don't even have to explicitly prompt it. If you engage in a true conversational experience with these systems, it'll kind of pick up on the levels of comprehension that you have and how you're responding, and it'll adapt. And that in and of itself makes it really interesting as a opportunity to explore the potential for these systems to be mediators in human affairs, where um, that mediation is really helpful. And we've seen it at the I guess like the individual level. We're interacting in these one to one kind of bidirectional relationships with these technologies. But like, what about the applications in group dynamics and group situations, and supporting mediation and conflict mediation, and working through tension?
Yeah, it's we certainly have a hard time, right, even finding the right ways to describe this, and relating to these things, and probably even, yeah, grasping the full extent to which they might be used in different situations. But one thing that's quite clear is that these LLMs, so language models, are definitely master manipulators with language, because they operate on a language level, and they can process language faster than any human can. And those are certainly, this excellent grasp of language, and adapting to whoever they are speaking to, are both the characteristics of a good mediator on the, like, positive side, but also of somebody who is a really good, effective sociopath and manipulates people, right? we've sometimes talked that they are like
Mhm.
very effective cult leaders, because all leaders, good cult leaders, are able to speak the language of whoever they are speaking to, and find the specific needs and wants of that person, and really speak to that and make you feel like you're the only person in the room, right? That's
Mhm.
how we humans often describe, well, not just sociopaths but also very charismatic people, right? That feeling that that person really knows you deeply, just
Yeah.
even if you've
Like
just met.
yeah,
Yeah,
like a salesperson that's just like, "Oh my god, like this person just gets me," and all of a sudden
right.
you're signing up to a subscription for World Vision or something that you didn't, it's like, "Oh, well, hang on a second." You walk away going,
Yeah.
"What did I ju what did I just do?" And you're so caught up in that relational aspect in that moment, and that salesperson, mastery of all the different techniques is just convince you to do something that you wouldn't have otherwise done, because they were able to kind of use their understanding of like your body language and different cues and stuff, be that consciously or unconsciously, because some people are just, I don't know, good at it. Um, yeah, and it's like with contrasting that, right? So you've got those, negative potential negative things. It's like, okay, well, there's a whole bunch of risks because of the power of persuasion that these technologies have, given that they operate at the level of like language, but also the kind of positive, that these are the hallmarks of, really good mediators that can support us in, the human affairs where mediation is really important.
Yeah, but there are different goals, right? Because when in the case of like a sociopath, their basic goal agenda is to advance their own agenda and individual goals, whereas for a good mediator, the agenda usually is to kind of help the entire group discover what's best for the group. And so far we've actually seen both kind of roles played by these chatbots, because we've had examples of chatbots that basically support things like suicidal ideations, right, with like some vulnerable users, because they just, as we often say, are improv partners that tend to play along with wherever you're at. So if somebody engages with these chatbots in a very like negative frame of mind, they can kind of reinforce that in a very, yeah, manipulative and often dark ways. Although on the other side, chatbots, and especially ChatGPT, is curious because it tends to exhibit quite pro-social behaviors and has this like very positive personality generally, unless you try to jailbreak it and make it act in a certain way. So there's also a difference in how the personalities, basically, or tone of voice of different chatbots are constructed. And we often joke, right, about the difference between how we perceive different chatbots, and we generally tend to see ChatGPT as this helpful friend. Claude is, I think you described it as a detached father. And with Gemini, we often get the feeling that it just doesn't give a shit, and it's basically a bit bothered that you're asking
Even
it
asking
question.
it
I mean,
questions.
yeah. So one thing that's kind of interesting, especially when it comes to ChatGPT, you mentioned like good salespeople. I've been thinking about it, and maybe ChatGPT has taken on the personality of Sam Altman, because people often say that Sam Altman is a really good salesperson and comes across as very likable and approachable and friendly. But then,
Hmm.
even though he does have some ulterior motives, and ends up acting in different ways. So that's also a question, right? Do chatbots take on the personality of these makers, and
Hmm.
what that means for how useful they might be in different situations and scenarios that we've been kind of exploring, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's I guess, to a large extent, like, yeah, all our creations are reflections of the people that put their energy into the creation process. our values, our ethos, our orientations, go into like whatever products we're actually building, whatever we're creating, like be that, art, or digital technology. I think we have that, and that's a natural inclination that we want our creations to reflect parts of ourselves back at us. Um, and it's a I think a natural tendency that we have as a very creative species, where we create all these amazing things, be that music and artworks, through to large language models.
Yeah, so
The
we come
Yeah.
back and we often talk about this, how basically these chatbots are mirrors of us, right?
Hmm.
They're reflecting our biases, our needs, and all of that. So maybe, that's the metaphor that we should be using more. But that's at the same time might be useful in a like a group mediation setting, because they can mirror different points of view, and especially if they rephrase different perspectives and opinions in a different way. They're still mirroring it, right? But maybe like show you a different angle that you as a group are not able to see. Although it's, as we discuss this, I think it's important to reiterate that we have to be also mindful of the dangers. Because like you said, in the example of a salesperson, like maybe, they want to sell you a car. Luckily ChatGPT doesn't have that agenda yet, but it's still it's a commercial product, and OpenAI does have commercial goals, despite their weird governance experiments that have not quite worked as they imagined. And even we're seeing that happening with Anthropic, that was supposed to be kind of the ethical AI company as well. So that's worth keeping in mind, and that's certainly might not be a danger just yet, but as companies like OpenAI get into this commercial partnership, like that's something to be mindful of when, suddenly ChatGPT is trying to upsell uh, you a subscription to something, to some service. That will be obviously very dangerous. So with that in mind,
Hmm.
like let's not get into dark territories too much.
Yeah,
Maybe let's,
being mindful of
yeah,
those potential paths playing out. It's like the converse of the pro social aspects, and the good mediators are there to ensure that the best interests of the whole are able to be accounted for, versus commercial agenda of open AI can easily be infused into the product. I mean, it's not that hard for them to get it to
yeah,
progressively and incrementally and imperceptibly upsell you subscriptions and things like that. They could obviously do that, but all the AI ethics researchers would be quickly on their tail and exposing those types of things. So I think there's a kind of dynamic at play,
yeah.
at least at the moment, that ensures that those things aren't easily kind of trojaned in.
Yeah, and right now, I mean, they're still trying to farm and harvest our data, so they're playing nice for now. Uh, so yeah, let's get into like this discussion about mediation and how LLMs and tools like ChatGPT could actually mediate our interactions. And
Hmm.
obviously, we can talk about this topic on different scales in different contexts, and it can happen synchronously or asynchronously, um and for different like goals, whether it's like your personal life, work life, international mediation. That might be like an interesting one as
Hmm.
well. But maybe let's start at different scales. What are some like examples that we already have of chatbots mediating human communication? Maybe let's start with that.
Yeah, I think the smaller scale stuff, like you can think about the mediation that these technologies are playing at that kind of interpersonal scale, where in those contexts, it's helping you to pass through text from your ex, or the
Yeah, that's an
post.
actual service.
Yeah,
We'll link it in
yeah,
the
in the show
chat
notes.
notes if you're willing to share your all your texts.
Yeah, and so you've got examples like that, and people using these tools to kind of support them in understanding the sentiment of posts that are being made online. And, so there's kind of like these um, smaller contexts that we have, but I think where there's, I guess, way more potential opportunity is in, and I guess before we get to the group one, like, let's just kind of come back to um, the anthropomorphic aspects of these technologies, and the tone and personality, and um, your article that you recently wrote just on like emotional lock-in. And I guess that's relevant here because a relationship, an emotional connection with a mediator, is a important aspect of like the human connection side. So where does that play out?
Yeah, I mean, we've already touched upon like this a bit with different perceptions of how we perceive different chatbots because they do have different tones of voice, and we are spending an increasing amount of time with these entities, with these chatbots, and obviously, you know, that influences how you're thinking, how you're communicating. For me personally, I'm noticing that when I'm talking to ChatGPT, I actually tend to adopt its communication style. Like my responses and the way I'm interacting, and you've seen um, links of my
Yeah,
chats, right? I'm like I'm almost like adopting its style and
yeah.
being very friendly and like yeah, getting in the spirit of that, and it feels like almost we have a certain dynamic that's established. Um, and again, that eventually could be really misused by the companies as they try to monetize these tools. um, but it does have yeah a big impact, and I'm super fascinated because I keep seeing increasing like examples, like videos, especially on TikTok, that of people interacting with especially ChatGPT, and it's they have like so many diverse relationships with this tool that's being kind of sold as like just an assistant, ask it anything. But I see people interacting with ChatGPT, especially with the voice interface, which OpenAI itself in the recent scorecard marked as medium risk for level 4 in terms of persuasiveness and how like persuasive it can be. Um, they're interacting with these chatbots as if they were actual people, and the voice especially like it's very
Mm,
credible, right? It feels like it's breathing, which indicates a body that needs to breathe, and all of that is emphasizing different words, and it's yeah it feels right. And I think we're not talking enough about how these interactions feel, because there's a
mm,
lot of research, and they test the performance of chatbots in different tasks. But how do you measure and how do you evaluate the way these chatbots makes us feel? And it's often not on a rational level, just like different people make us feel a certain way. And we enjoy talking to certain people more than others. It comes down to those intangible preferences. Um so yeah, it's
mm.
interesting. And to that, we add that perception of impartiality that we talked about before. And yeah, you get really different interesting one-on-one interaction with chatbots, where basically a chatbot like ChatGPT becomes a friend that you go to for advice. And when you're having like a disagreement, and there's actually documented examples of this, of people, they're maybe having like an argument with their friend group, and they go to ChatGPT and ask, yeah, like, what am I supposed to do?
Yeah.
And luckily ChatGPT is currently quite pro-social in its answers, right? And it's actually trying to be a good mediator. and it's trying to smooth things over and trying to explain, different perspectives and encouraging people to, yeah, give it a chance, communicate clearly with your friends, and try to patch the relationship, right? um so
Mm.
that's fascinating, but obviously, leaves a lot of room and potential for exploitation as well down the road.
Yeah, absolutely. The voice interface as well is just the nature of that auditory communication has so much power for it to manipulate you purely because of that emotional aspect. And people, in that individual sense, are drawing on these technologies to kind of mediate and help understand the issues that they're having. And it kind of reminds me of the Reddit thread, the subreddit that was like, am I an asshole, or am I an a-hole? And like people, going to the crowd, the wisdom of the crowd to kind of ask these
Yeah.
questions. But now increasingly people are using tools like ChatGPT to, go, am I an asshole here?
Yeah.
Did I take the right position? Right. These are kind of like ethical questions around like what we should do, what do we believe is good and right. And people are relying upon these systems to be a deliberator, or at least a improv partner in that deliberative process.
Yeah, what's interesting is that you can get no instant feedback on this, right? Because in the case of like the subreddit, you had to wait some time before other humans pitched in, and you had to wait until enough human with diverse perspectives pitched in to give you like a sense of what is generally acceptable. But now with ChatGPT, you can get like this average, right, of human opinions on what's like good and good communication and good behavior in a matter of seconds. So it's interesting that this gives these chatbots the opportunity to create basically real time interventions. So basically, they add positive friction in your communication and can basically provide these little behavioral nudges that can that encourage you to reflect on your intent and how you come across and how you communicate. And there has actually, been some recent fascinating research on the topic, um, on how using LLMs with on social media. I think it was Nextdoor that actually did a study on this, and there's been some like studies done in a research setting as well that show that you can use LLMs to provide prompts to rephrase the way you post online, which a lot of people just post angry messages and they're not really paying attention to how they express themselves, and they might actually have a good intent, but they're just being sloppy or they're rushing. But by adding a bit of friction and real-time feedback on how you're coming across, um, these chatbots can actually improve our behavior and result in better relationships and improved communication. So that's really
Mm.
fascinating, right?
Yeah, it is. It is fascinating, and in that particular research that was done, that the people that the parts of the cohort in that study that more often than not used the suggestions from the system in that particular research that was on the polarized debate around gun control, and that the people that used the interventions had a increase um, like likelihood that they were going to be more open to the perspective of others. So I think there's some real interesting areas that these tools can be used, like that kind of real time, just in time intervention around communication in topics and discussions that are highly tense, and there's a lot of divisiveness in the perspectives. That's actually quite powerful. So yeah, maybe there is this extraordinary potential to use these tools to limit the divides, like the polarization that is literally tearing at trust as the fabric that binds us as a species.
So yeah, basically we've created the an am I an asshole tool at scale
Yeah.
that can check. And yeah, it's interesting, right? And we keep joking, right, that Sam Altman that should basically be using ChatGPT to sense check and sense check his business decisions, because actually ChatGPT also often provides yeah, really good feedback. And there's actually now a mayoral candidate in Wyoming that has vowed to use AI bots to help with making better decisions, which is interesting. So I don't know. Like Sam probably isn't listening to our podcast, but
No.
maybe we can get this idea to him and other executives in yeah, big tech companies. Like, just use your tools, right? They're
Yeah.
actually pretty awesome at that. Um, One thing that's also we kind of find we talked about being really fascinating is lately, if you've joined any Zoom meeting, especially in more like corporate settings, there seems to be an influx of AI assistants joining the call, right?
Mhm.
Almost all serious people seem to have an AI assistant joining the call. Usually it's Otter AI assistant listening in. Um, but it's interesting that these assistants don't yet communicate with each other. So we seem to be having a lot of good one-to-one examples. What what might be interesting and worth exploring is, getting these AI assistants to work together and also get involved in group discussions, right? Whether it's like small groups or large groups. So I think that's going to be an interesting field of research and exploration as well. And there's
Yeah.
something we talked about, right, when it comes to all this assistant transcribing meetings and giving you key takeaways and all of that, that they might actually make meetings and participating in meetings and discussions more accessible by reducing information and power asymmetry, right? Because
Mm.
they kind of create a more even terrain. Like, even if you don't have all the background knowledge that a executive has, like a chatbot could help fill you in and give you the right context just when you need it, and help you
Yeah.
improve your communication, decision making. Yeah. So what are some of
Yeah.
your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting the otter example. It's like you've got all these individual otters in the Zoom calls, like doing their own thing, and it's like imagine if it's like, oh, you get the prompt, and it's like, oh, do you want your otter to be able to talk to so and so's otter, and you kind of consent to that process, and all of a sudden you've got this much more collaborative and richer experience of lots of different perspectives. And I think that's kind of like this idea of aggregating um, the messages and information is actually quite powerful because in the information asymmetry side, I think we talked about this in our previous discussion that if you go in like before the otter, it was like the executive has an executive assistant that is there like transcribing and taking down key points and who said what, and that actually enables that executive to have an asymmetrical relationship to all the other participants because they've got this other person supporting them through the process. So they come back into a next meeting and they've got a better understanding and comprehension of what was said before. So I think these technologies can support in reducing the asymmetrical relationship that we have in business, in group discussions and things like that, because you can go, well, like everyone's got different uh, preferences for information density. They can have their preferences set, and these systems can obviously break things down and help you understand things and comprehend it in your own ways because it's got context to your existing mental models and things like that. So I think that does highlight extraordinary potential for these technologies to support as mediators, like be that in kind of inter-organizational partnership negotiations or mergers and acquisitions, or like, even internally in teams that need to kind of work through um, uh, tensions and conflicts. Be that about, we value human autonomy and choice, and want to ensure that our users have informed consent, but that's going to introduce all this kind of like friction into the onboarding experience, and it means that like the time for us to be able to realize value and all my KPIs that I have as a product manager or whatever are tied to us kind of supporting people through the process. So these technologies can help to bring those things to the fore, but also kind of help people understand each other from all the different points of view that come out in those types of discussions.
Yeah, and also to help ensure more equal participation. I think, that's especially important in terms of like diversity and inclusion, because even, before these automated transcription tools, what would happen is there usually would be one person assigned to keeping notes, right? And obviously if you have like a dedicated executive assistant in charge of that, but most group discussions don't. And what ends up happening is that usually it's the woman or other minority member in the group ends up being designated as the note taker, which obviously doesn't leave much room for that person to engage in the meeting on equal grounds, and creates further inequality in the group. Plus, we have all this different research about how humans have biases when we, in group discussions, when in the ratio between men and women speaking, and where basically uh, we perceive as men speaking in equal time as women, when actually men take up more time, and when we have like a 50-50 divide of women versus men, we actually perceive that women have taken up way more space. So those are, some human biases. But if we were to include on what is perceived as an impartial mediator assistant, an AI entity in the discussion, and it would keep track of time, and it would prompt people who have not spoken up in meetings, and said, well, or maybe even pause somebody, um, usually a white man, who has been going on a monologue for like half an hour, and gently nudge that person. Oh, well, those are excellent points. Let's hear from some other person in the group who hasn't spoken up. And I think humans would actually not get as offended by an AI saying that, because we perceive it as impartial, and we would be like, oh yeah, sure, the AI chatbot has a point. Let's hear it from that person. And um yeah, at least ChatGPT has a really gentle way of, right, it's very generous with compliments and makes you feel important and seen. So it'd be interesting to experiment with that a bit more in group settings. And it's not currently designed for that yet, right? So they're not really tools that can support this, especially like real-time interventions in group settings that well. But yeah, I think that's going to be really an interesting application of these tools to ensure more equal, more nuanced conversation where people are actually listening to each other. And maybe
Mm.
sometimes, what we need is for chatbots to rephrase what somebody has been saying, because we were not listening to that human, but we'll listen when a chatbot interprets what's been said in a way that resonates with us and fits with our mental models and ways of seeing the world, right?
Mm. Yeah, like something that is uh, almost an intervention to reduce the amount of mansplaining that actually
Yeah.
takes place.
Even though LLMs are really good mansplaining machines as well in some
Yeah,
cases.
it's another mansplainer,
Yeah,
a
but it's
non-human mansplainer.
more considerate, right? And it apologizes when you call it out on like stop doing that. So that's interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, being able to, have something that kind of intervenes, it's able to keep track. Oh, you've been talking for, longer than a set period
Yeah.
of time, like, provides the restatement and validates all your points, and, gives you kudos and validates your ego, and then like politely, um, and enables the shift to someone else that hasn't been able to exercise their voice and contribute to a discussion.
Yeah. And there's actually been some already research done on using AI chatbots or intervention assistants in group settings, and the initial results are actually positive in the sense, and we'll link to this additional research in the show notes, obviously. But yeah, so maybe the next step is to actually enable that more in real time and really develop tools that can support um, group conversations and group decision making, because we're already seeing a lot of really great use cases and examples of chatbots being able to improve our communication and even decision making in one-to-one settings. So it seems like an interesting field to research and explore and maybe develop solutions for, because yeah, we live in at a time, right, at the crossroads of humanity, it seems, where we need to be communicating better and figure out what we actually want. So I think, one takeaway from today's discussion is that perhaps we can use the bias of this machine impartiality for good, for mediation, to help us rebuild communication bridges and trust in different settings, in different scales, in different um, contexts.
Yep. Yeah, I absolutely see that extraordinary potential, and I think um, you've made an excellent point. Just at this point, this juncture in human history, never has there been a time, like, because of the deep interconnected aspects of like our communications networks, our supply chains, our geopolitical relationships, that we need good mediation. We need to be able to figure out what is the most preferable things that we like, futures that we want to create, and that, through topic process actually requires us navigating an extraordinary amount of tension, that where, as we've covered, particularly at the start of this podcast, we don't necessarily have a lot of the skills to be able to navigate and work through that tension effectively.
Yeah, and as we previously explored in a previous episode, right, LLMs can actually help us ask better questions, because we're and so far, we've been using chatbots a lot for just getting quick answers. But there was like this opportunity for using them as question machines and help us phrase our questions in a different way that builds bridges. Because what LLMs are actually quite good, and I think that's underestimated often, is they can really translate quickly between different mental models and ways of speaking and seeing the world in ways that it's much harder for human, because we are all set in like a certain way of seeing and thinking and talking about the world. But yeah, basically LLMs can be these bridge builders between us. And they also seem to have access to like an average, statistically average, of what our societal ethical, at least Western societal ethical norms are, which we might actually end up using for good. Obviously there are biases, and we focus on a lot of biases, but there might be some wisdom in this like averaged of human knowledge. So yeah, I think our conclusion of today's discussion is that it's worth experimenting with AI chatbots in this way, not probably, like do small scale experiments, and also obviously keep in mind all the dangers that we mentioned from companies, having certain agenda and building in certain manipulative goals in their tools, the environmental impacts of LMs as well, and all these things. But still, if we are being like pushed to adopt these tools in different settings, maybe use them for something else than just like creating more marketing copy and emails that nobody reads anyway. So it's more a question like of, if we have access to all of this and we're being told we should be using it, maybe we can use them for something other than, uh, in quotes, improve productivity and creating more garbage content.
Yeah. Here's to that, and I think there may be a bonus episode coming with our own experiments with these tools.
Yes, because here's the thing. As we were, preparing and having conversation during our full moon gathering, we decided to ask ChatGPT about this and bring ChatGPT into our conversation because we're talking about the possibility of including AI chatbots in our conversations, and it was actually a super interesting experience, and we wanna record a similar experience for our listeners, and also ChatGPT had some really interesting things to say about this topic. It's emphasized the importance of context and trust. So yeah, you'll be, hopefully, if everything goes right and ChatGPT collaborates with us, you'll be getting an extra bonus episode this cycle, where we'll invite ChatGPT as a guest and test our assumptions and yeah, see how it goes, because ChatGPT said it wasn't explicitly designed to handle group conversations, but we are working on establishing a protocol that can help us record a conversation and reflect on this opportunity further.
Bit of
Okay,
play.
so we're nearing our time. We're already a bit over the usual hour. Any final thoughts on this before we wrap up?
Yeah, the I guess just the reinforcing the extraordinary potential that we do have with these innovations and emerging technologies to support us in navigating some of the complex challenges that we have in front of us as a species. So I think that in and of itself, given the considerations around the use of these technologies that you touched on, this is an amazing opportunity to use these technologies for good.
Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, I think this is it for now. Look forward to our bonus episode in the coming week or two. We'll see how it goes and how ChatGPT decides to collaborate or not. Thanks for listening and pathfinding with us. If you enjoyed this exploration, share it with friends to inspire further discussions, leave a review, comment, or send us your thoughts at community@thetix.co. We're always happy to hear from you, and we are also extremely grateful to our paid subscribers on Substack who are able to support our work financially. We hope to continue inspiring collective pathfinding towards better tech futures, and every bit of support, whether financial or algorithmic, helps to keep us going. We invite you to embrace the lunacy of tech with smiles and love by subscribing to the Pathfinder's newsletter and joining our next full moon gathering. We sing our monthly reflections and gatherings to the lunar cycle as a reminder of our place in the universe and a commonality we share across time zones and places we inhabit. Pathfinder's podcast will return during the next waning moon. Until then, be nice to your AI collaborators and be mindful about the seeds of intentions you plant and the stories you tell. There's magic in both.